Do your friends really call you Chuck?
Everyone calls me Chuck except CB.
Before his death, Robert Mitchum said something that quietly shook Hollywood. Not a scandal screamed in headlines, not a bitter attack, but a calm, unsettling truth about a man America believed it fully understood. In one of his final reflections, Mitchum revealed that Charlton Heston, the towering symbol of honor, strength, and moral certainty, was not always the man audiences saw on a screen. Behind the heroic voice, behind the statuesque posture, behind roles like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, there was another side few ever talked about. And when those words came from Robert Mitchum, Hollywood's most brutally honest outsider, they carried a weight that could not be ignored. Mitchum was never a man who cared about protecting myths. He despised Hollywood's polished facades, its carefully managed reputations, and its manufactured legends. If he spoke, it was because he believed the truth mattered more than comfort. As he looked back on a lifetime inside the industry, Mitchum made it clear: Hollywood heroes are not carved from marble. They are human, flawed, complicated, and sometimes the greatest illusions exist off-screen. But to understand why Mitchum's words were so powerful, we must first understand who Robert Mitchum really was and how a childhood marked by hardship forged one of the most authentic figures in cinema history. Long before fame ever found him, Robert Mitchum's life was already shaped by a struggle. He was born on August 6, 1917, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, into a working-class family that knew instability far better than comfort. His father worked as a railroad laborer and a stunt performer, a dangerous line of work that offered little security. When Mitchum was still a child, his father died suddenly, leaving his mother to raise the family alone. From that moment on, Mitchum's childhood came a series of restless moves, financial hardship, and emotional uncertainty. There were no Hollywood dreams, no safety nets, and no illusions about how hard life could be. He learned early that survival required toughness, independence, and a refusal to complain. Those early years gave Mitchum something many actors never possessed: authenticity. He did not need to act rugged or world-weary. He had lived it. As a teenager, Mitchum drifted across the country, taking odd jobs wherever he could find them. He worked as a laborer, a ditch digger, even a boxer. Trouble followed him at times, and authority never sat well with him. Schools, rules, and rigid structures felt like cages to a young man who had already learned that life rarely played fair. This rough, unsettled upbringing would later become the foundation of his screen presence. When Mitchum stood silently in front of a camera, audiences believed him, not because of technique, but because his eyes carried experience, pain, fatigue, a quiet understanding of life's darker corners. When Hollywood finally entered his life in the 1940s, Mitchum did not arrive polished or eager to please. He arrived as he was, unfiltered, skeptical, and uninterested in pretending to be anything else. That attitude would soon set him apart in an industry built on artifice, but his rise to stardom was anything but smooth, and the way he challenged Hollywood's acting traditions would change cinema forever. When Robert Mitchum finally stepped into Hollywood, he did not fit the mold. The 1940s were dominated by dramatic gestures, booming dialogue, and carefully rehearsed performances. Actors were expected to perform emotion, big, expressive, unmistakable. Mitchum did the opposite. He lowered his voice. He slowed his movements. Sometimes he barely moved at all. And somehow, it worked. Mitchum's presence felt lived in. His silence spoke louder than monologues. His eyes carried tension, regret, and moral uncertainty without a single line of dialogue. Audiences didn't feel like they were watching a character. They felt like they were watching a man. Early roles in films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and Undercurrent revealed something different. Mitchum wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't chasing applause. He simply existed on a screen, and the camera loved him for it. This understated style quickly became his signature. While other actors projected confidence and heroism, Mitchum introduced ambiguity. His characters were often tired, conflicted, or emotionally guarded. They weren't clean-cut heroes. They were men shaped by choices and consequences. That approach reached its defining moment in 1947 with Out of the Past. As Private Detective Jeff Bailey, Mitchum embodied the essence of film noir, a man trapped by his past, haunted by desire, fully aware that every path leads to loss. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't fight fate. He accepted it. This role cemented Mitchum as Hollywood's ultimate anti-hero. Not evil, not virtuous, just human. Directors soon realized something remarkable. Mitchum didn't need direction. He instinctively understood pacing, silence, and emotional restraint. He trusted the audience to feel what he felt without being told how to feel it. In an era of exaggeration, Mitchum's minimalism felt revolutionary. But what made his legacy even more extraordinary was his range. The same man who defined noir darkness would soon terrify audiences and then surprise them again. By the time Robert Mitchum became a star, Hollywood thought it understood him. They believed he was built for brooding men, quiet drifters, dangerous anti-heroes with cigarettes and secrets. And yes, he owned that world so completely that he seemed born for it. But Mitchum's greatest weapon was that he never allowed anyone to reduce him to one thing. Because when he wanted to, he could become terrifying. In 1955, he delivered one of the most chilling performances of his career in The Night of the Hunter. Mitchum played preacher Harry Powell, a man who wrapped evil in scripture, smiling while he hunted the vulnerable. What made it so disturbing wasn't loud violence or wild outbursts. It was his calmness. His voice stayed controlled. His face stayed almost peaceful. And that quiet menace became unbearable because it felt real. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to overplay evil. He simply let it breathe. That performance proved Mitchum wasn't just a cool noir guy. He could embody darkness in its most unsettling form, the kind that hides behind charm. And then, almost cruelly, he showed the world how he could do the opposite. Mitchum could step into lighter roles too. War pictures, westerns, even moments that revealed warmth and humor beneath the stoic exterior. Films like The Story of G.I. Joe showed a softer side, balancing the cold mystique with something surprisingly human. That versatility kept him relevant as Hollywood changed. Studios rose and fell, genres shifted, new stars arrived. But Mitchum stayed because he could adjust without ever betraying who he was. And off-screen, he carried the same fearless authenticity. He was witty, sarcastic, and openly dismissive of Hollywood pretension. Executives didn't know how to control him. Publicists didn't know how to polish him. And that was exactly how Mitchum wanted it. He wasn't manufactured. He wasn't convenient. He was real. But while his career made him legendary, his personal life was far more complicated and far more painful than most people realize. Behind Robert Mitchum's bad boy mythology was a marriage that almost nobody believed could last. In March 1940, Mitchum married Dorothy Haspence, long before he became the iconic face of noir coolness, long before the fame, the temptations, and the endless whispers that followed him through Hollywood. Dorothy was often described as patient, grounded, and resilient, and she had to be, because Mitchum's rise to stardom didn't just bring success, it brought pressure, it brought chaos, and it brought women constantly. Together, Robert and Dorothy had 3 children, building a family inside an industry that devoured families for entertainment. While the public saw Mitchum as untouchable, effortless, confident, above consequences, the truth was that his personal life was filled with contradictions. The most painful one was simple. Robert Mitchum was not a faithful husband. His charm and the temptations of Hollywood led him into numerous affairs throughout their marriage. It wasn't a secret inside a studio circles. It became tabloid fuel, the kind of a story that painted him as a man who lived by his own rules and never apologized for it. And yet, Dorothy stayed, not because she didn't know, not because she was blind, but because whatever existed between them was deeper, messier, and more complicated than outsiders could understand. She endured humiliation with grace. She navigated scandal with discretion. She held the family together while Mitchum continued living like a man convinced he could outrun consequences. And strangely, almost unbelievably, this marriage survived. From 1940 until Mitchum's death in 1997, they remained together for nearly 6 decades. In Hollywood, where relationships collapsed under far less strain, their union became one of the most extraordinary, unconventional love stories of the era. It was not a perfect marriage. It was not a romantic fairy tale. But it was real, and in a way, it revealed something important about Mitchum. For all his self-indulgence and rebellion, there was still a personal code inside him, one that, even when he failed, still recognized the gravity of family and the permanence of Dorothy's place in his life. But then, near the end of his journey, Mitchum began speaking in a way that startled people. He started reflecting not only on himself, but on other legends, and that's when the name Charlton Heston entered the story. By the time Robert Mitchum reached the final stretch of his life, he had nothing left to prove. He had already become a legend. He had already survived scandals. He had already outlasted studios, trends, and competitors. And most importantly, he no longer cared about protecting anyone's image. So when he spoke about Charlton Heston in what would later surface as one of his final conversations, people listened differently. Because Charlton Heston was not just another actor, he was the symbol, the towering Hollywood hero, a man audiences trusted before he even spoke a line. Heston's screen presence was built like a monument, strong, clean, commanding. Films like Ben-Hur and the 10 Commandments didn't just make him famous, they turned him into an emblem of integrity and classical heroism. And that's exactly why Mitchum's words landed like a cold gust through a warm room. Mitchum said Heston wasn't always what he seemed. He explained that people loved to put Heston on a pedestal, but there was a side most never saw. And coming from Mitchum, an actor known for blunt honesty and disdain for Hollywood pretension, it didn't sound like gossip. It sounded like a man describing the truth he had watched for decades. Mitchum's perspective wasn't based on rumors from outsiders. It came from the world behind the curtain. The parties, the premieres, the same industry circles where public legends were built and protected. He described how, away from cameras and applause, some personalities changed. You start to realize, Mitchum implied, that the legend and the person don't always match. Then Mitchum went deeper, careful, not cruel, but uncomfortably specific. He said Heston could be incredibly charming, but there were moments of stubbornness, arrogance, and an obsession with control that could be hard to handle. That line mattered, because he wasn't calling Heston a villain, he wasn't destroying his legacy, he was humanizing him. And in Hollywood, sometimes that feels more dangerous than scandal. Mitchum also touched on something even darker, how complicated friendships can be in an industry where everyone is always performing. People like to imagine stars as one big family, he suggested, but Hollywood is business first. Friendships blur with rivalry. Politeness hides competition, and you never truly know who is sincere and who is simply playing a role off camera. Then, almost like a man speaking to the living from the edge of the grave, Mitchum's words shifted toward mortality. When you've been around as long as I have, you see the cracks in the masks people wear. And you realize the truth about someone isn't what you read in magazines or see in interviews. It's something else entirely, something far more human. That wasn't just about Heston anymore. That was Mitchum describing Hollywood itself, a place where icons are constructed carefully and where the real person is often hidden behind a wall of image, expectation, and myth. But while Mitchum's honesty shocked people, his final years carried another cruel reality. His body was breaking down, and the hard living habits that once made him look untouchable were now coming to collect their price. For most of his life, Robert Mitchum looked like a man who couldn't be worn down. That was part of the mythology. The half-lidded stare, the slow voice, the unbothered smile that made him seem untouchable. But in the final chapter of his life, something changed. The hard living image that had followed him for decades stopped being a costume and became a consequence. Mitchum was a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, not the occasional cigarette for a photo, not the casual habit people could quit when they felt like it. This was something woven into his everyday existence, on sets, during interviews, in private moments. In his generation, smoking was almost as common as breathing, and for a man like Mitchum, it became part of the aura. It reinforced the persona audiences loved, the world-weary man who didn't chase approval, the tough, silent figure who carried shadows inside him. But time doesn't admire legends. Time only collects dates. As the years passed, the toll of decades of smoking became impossible to hide. His body began to weaken in ways that even his sharp wit couldn't laugh away. People close to him noticed the fatigue first, how he seemed drained more often, how the strength in his presence wasn't as solid as it once was. Then came the diagnosis: lung cancer. It was devastating, not just because of the illness itself, but because it attacked the very thing Mitchum had built his identity around: strength, control, stoicism, that quiet sense of indestructibility. Breathing became difficult, energy disappeared. The physical decline grew steady and undeniable, a slow unraveling of the man who once seemed carved from iron. And yet even then, Mitchum did not become sentimental. He didn't publicly beg for sympathy. He didn't romanticize suffering. He didn't perform tragedy the way Hollywood sometimes expects tragedy to be performed. Instead, he faced it the way he faced everything, bluntly. He accepted the consequences of his choices with a fatalistic honesty. The same realism that shaped his screen characters now shaped his real life. It was as if he understood deeply that life always catches up, no matter how cool you look while running. There was something haunting in that, because while many people spend their last years trying to rewrite their story, Mitchum seemed to simply look at his life and say, this is what it was, this is what it cost, and this is what happens next. And then on July 1st, 1997, in Santa Barbara, California, Robert Mitchum died from complications of lung cancer. He was 79 years old. His death didn't just close a life, it closed an era where movie stars were larger than life, yet openly flawed, where excess and brilliance lived side by side, where authenticity could still exist inside an industry built on illusion. And when news of his passing spread, tributes poured in. Actors, filmmakers, critics, many of them saying the same thing in different words. Mitchum didn't just perform characters, he inhabited them. With the smallest shift of expression, he could show menace, tenderness, irony, exhaustion. He made it feel real because in many ways it was real. But here's the chilling part. The shocking truth he shared about Charlton Heston wasn't really about Heston alone. It was Mitchum's final reminder that behind every polished legend, there is a human being, and humans have cracks. Now the question becomes, if Mitchum could pull the curtain back on someone as untouchable as Charlton Heston, what else about Hollywood's golden age might have been carefully hidden? Hollywood has always been a factory, not just for movies, but for myths. And Robert Mitchum understood that better than most because he lived inside it while refusing to belong to it. When Mitchum spoke about Charlton Heston near the end of his life, the most unsettling detail wasn't the specific words: stubbornness, arrogance, obsession with control. The unsettling part was what those words represented. They represented the quiet truth Hollywood tries to bury. A public persona is not a person, it's a product. Charlton Heston's image was built on a strength, conviction, and moral certainty. In the eyes of many Americans, he didn't just play heroes, he seemed to embody heroism itself. The kind of man you'd want beside you in a crisis. The kind of man you trust without hesitation. But Mitchum hinted that off-camera, the equation changed. He wasn't saying Heston was fake all the time. He wasn't even saying Heston was bad. He was saying something far more uncomfortable. A man can be inspiring in public and difficult in private. A man can be charming and controlling. A man can be admired and still have flaws that the audience never gets to see. And Mitchum had seen enough of Hollywood to know that those contradictions weren't rare, they were normal, because in that world everyone is performing, even at parties, even at premieres, even during friendly conversations. The difference is that the cameras are invisible and the stakes are higher. Mitchum described the blurred line between friendship and rivalry, the way people smile while calculating, the way respect can sometimes be fear, the way good relationships can simply mean two powerful people choosing not to wage war in public. And that's why Mitchum's words about Heston carried an eerie realism. They weren't a takedown. They were a warning to the public not to confuse the role with the human being. Because what happens when someone becomes a symbol? They stop being allowed to be human. Every flaw becomes unacceptable. Every contradiction becomes dangerous. Every private moment becomes a threat to the legend. So studios protect the image. Publicists shape the narrative, fans defend the myth, and the real person gets buried under applause. Mitchum didn't want that. Maybe because he had spent his entire career refusing to polish himself into a symbol. He let people see the rough edges. He let them feel the fatigue and ambiguity. He never pretended to be perfect because he knew perfection was a trap. And in the final years of his life, with death close enough to feel, Mitchum seemed to be saying, stop worshiping masks, stop believing magazines, stop confusing legends with truth. Because the truth is always more human. And that brings us to the final question, the one that lingers after everything Mitchum said. What do we do with a legend once we realize they were never flawless? Do we tear them down, or do we finally understand them? In the end, Robert Mitchum wasn't trying to destroy Charlton Heston. That's the part many people misunderstand. If Mitchum had wanted to humiliate him, he could have done it with cruelty. He could have turned his word into a public spectacle, but he didn't. His tone, even when blunt, carried something else. Something quieter and heavier, a kind of final honesty. Because when Mitchum spoke about Heston not always being what he seemed, it wasn't simply a comment about one man, it was a comment about an entire era, about the way Hollywood builds giants and then demands that they never show weakness. Mitchum had lived long enough to see what happens when the public turns people into statues. Statues don't get to be complicated. Statues don't get to be flawed. Statues don't get to have bad days, harsh moods, stubborn pride, or the hunger to control what they can't control. But human beings do. And Mitchum, standing near the end of his own life, seemed to be offering one last perspective, one last warning before the curtain came down. He had spent decades watching the same pattern repeat. A star becomes a hero on the screen. The public falls in love with the idea. The industry protects the image. And the truth, the messy, imperfect human truth, gets locked away. Then time passes, age comes, mortality arrives, and suddenly the legend cracks. Not because someone ruined them, but because no legend can survive reality forever. Mitchum understood mortality in a way only the dying truly do. In his final reflections, you could feel it, the sense that life strips away the fake things when you're close to the end. When you're running out of time, you stop guarding myths, you stop performing, you stop pretending. You look at people the way they actually were. Charm and stubbornness, warmth and arrogance, talent and control, dignity and insecurity, and you realize something that hits like a punch to the chest. The truth about someone isn't what you read in magazines or see in interviews. It's something else entirely, something far more human. That was Mitchum's final lesson. Not that Heston was a fraud, not that Hollywood is evil, but that we, the audience, often demand perfection from people who were never built for it. And when we finally see the cracks, we act shocked when the cracks were always there. So what do we do with that truth? If we're honest, it makes the legacy more powerful because it reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires impact. It requires the ability to leave something behind that outlives the flaws. Robert Mitchum left that behind, a career that spanned decades. A screen presence so authentic it still feels modern. A defiant honesty that refused to be polished into a lie. And even his final words about Heston, about masks, about truth, were part of that legacy. Because Mitchum didn't just want us to remember the legend. He wanted us to remember the human being,